On the morning of 27 February 1995, staff at Barings' London headquarters found a handwritten fax from Singapore. It read, in part, "I'm sorry." By that date, the bank that had helped finance the Napoleonic Wars carried a loss of approximately $827 million. That figure exceeded the entire reported capital of the institution. The trades that had generated it were recorded, in part, inside a single account carrying the number 88888. The structural question is this: how does one trading account absorb a loss larger than the bank that owns it, while the bank's own reporting systems classify the money flowing into it as ordinary business? The instrument at the center of Barings' collapse was the exchange-traded futures contract, together with the short option positions written against it. A futures contract is an obligation to buy or sell an asset at a set price on a future date. Traded on a regulated exchange, it is marked to market daily. Each day, gains and losses are settled in cash through a margin account. If a position moves against the holder, the exchange issues a margin call. The holder must post additional funds by the next settlement, or the position is liquidated. This daily settlement is the entire safety architecture of a futures exchange. It ensures that no participant can accumulate an unrealized loss without posting cash against it in near real time. Margin is not a formality. It is the mechanism by which the exchange guarantees that every contract can be honoured. Barings' Singapore operation, Barings Futures Singapore, was engaged in what was reported to London as arbitrage. The strategy, known internally as switching, exploited small price differences in the Nikkei 225 stock index futures contract, which traded on both the Osaka Securities Exchange in Japan and the Singapore International Monetary Exchange, SIMEX. In principle, arbitrage of this kind is low risk. The trader buys the contract on the cheaper exchange and simultaneously sells it on the more expensive one, locking in the spread. The positions offset. Net market exposure is close to zero. Reported as arbitrage, the Singapore book should have carried matched long and short positions. What London believed it was funding was a hedged, self-financing operation. What it was actually funding was something else entirely. The deception rested on the structure of the error account. On a trading floor, an error account holds trades that cannot be immediately allocated, a mispriced fill, a wrong contract, a transposed number. It exists to park mistakes until they are reconciled and reported to management. Barings. Futures Singapore had a standard error account. In July 1992, a second error account was opened. Its number was 88. Account 88 was configured so that its activity was excluded from the reports transmitted to London. The record establishes that London received the firm's market positions and its profit figures, but the reconciliation feed that would have exposed 8 was suppressed. This is the first structural element. There were two sets of numbers: the positions London saw and the positions that actually existed. The second element was the dual role held in Singapore. The individual running the trading desk also controlled the back office. In a functioning institution, these functions are strictly separated. The front office takes positions. The back office confirms, settles, and reconciles them independently. That separation is the internal control that makes the front office's numbers verifiable. In Singapore, both functions reported to the same person. The trader who created the positions also controlled the settlement records that were supposed to check them. Consider how the loss was concealed. Step 1. The Singapore book took directional positions on the Nikkei. not the matched arbitrage London believed it held. These were outright bets on market direction. Step 2. Losses on these positions were booked into account 88888, where they were invisible to London. Step 3. To make the reported book appear profitable, fictitious trades and false entries were recorded, so that the visible account showed the arbitrage profits London expected, while 88888 absorbed the reality. Step 4 is the element that turned concealment into a funding crisis. The positions in 88888 were real positions on a real exchange. Cymex issued margin calls against them daily. Those margin calls had to be met in cash, or the exchange would close the positions and expose the loss. So Barings Futures Singapore requested funds from London to meet margin. The requests were framed as funding for client positions and for the arbitrage business. London wired the money. Over the period, the record establishes that Barings transferred sums that eventually reached hundreds of millions of pounds to fund the Singapore operations' margin requirements. Each transfer was recorded in London as a routine advance to a profitable subsidiary. Structurally, London was funding its own concealed losses. The margin calls were the exchange demanding payment on losing bets, and the bank was paying them while believing it was capitalizing a winning business. The position grew because the strategy shifted. By early 1995, the book was heavily long Nikkei futures and short options, meaning it profited if the index stayed within a range and rose, and lost if the index fell or moved violently. On 17th of January 1995, the Kobe earthquake struck. The Nikkei fell sharply. The long futures position lost money as the index dropped. Rather than reduce the position, the record shows the book was increased, an attempt to move the market or to recover through a rebound. The larger the position grew, the larger the daily margin call, and the more cash London had to send to keep the concealed positions from being liquidated. By late February 1995, the notional value of the Nikkei futures position exceeded $7 billion. The options position added further exposure. The daily margin obligations had grown beyond what even Barings could fund, without the numbers becoming impossible to reconcile. The detection failure operated on several levels, and each is structural rather than a matter of individual negligence. Consider first the internal control failure. The combination of front office and back office authority in one person removed the single most important verification in trading operations. An internal audit conducted in 1994 identified this concentration of functions as a serious risk. The report recommended that the roles be separated. According to the record, the recommendation was not effectively implemented. The person who controlled the trades also controlled the records that were supposed to verify the trades, so no independent number existed inside the firm. Consider next the funding question, which is the clearest signal in the entire case. A genuine arbitrage operation is close to self-financing. Matched long and short positions do not generate large one-directional margin calls because losses on one leg are offset by gains on the other. Yet Singapore was requesting escalating cash transfers to meet margin. This is a structural contradiction. A hedged book does not consume hundreds of millions in funding. The size and direction of the cash demand was itself evidence that the reported strategy could not be the real one. The funding requests were met without the underlying inconsistency being resolved. Consider the reported profitability. The Singapore operation was reporting large profits from a low-risk arbitrage strategy. Arbitrage spreads are thin by nature, Outsized profits from thin spreads should prompt the question of what risk is actually being taken to generate them. The reported returns were inconsistent with the reported strategy, and that inconsistency was not reconciled. Consider finally the external gatekeepers. Cymex itself raised concerns about the size of Barings' positions and the margin being posted. Correspondence in the record shows the exchange sought assurances about the firm's ability to meet its obligations. Barings provided them. The exchange saw the position size, but not the concealment. London saw the funding requests, but not the positions. No single party held both halves of the picture. The concealment survived precisely because verification was fragmented across parties, each of whom saw a plausible partial view. For detection to have occurred earlier, one condition would have been sufficient: an independent reconciliation of the Singapore positions conducted by someone other than the trader against the exchange's own records. The exchange knew the true positions. It reported them in its own margin statements. A direct comparison of Cymex's position records against Barings' internal book would have revealed account 8 immediately. That comparison was not performed by an independent party until the collapse forced it. The unravelling was driven by the mechanism that had powered the fraud: the margin call. On 23rd of February 1995, the position was so large and the market had moved so far against it that the funding required to meet margin exceeded what could be raised or disguised. That evening, the individual running the desk left Singapore. The following day, London began attempting to reconcile the accounts and to locate the positions behind the funding requests. The reconciliation established the gap. The visible book and the actual positions did not match. Account 888888 held enormous losing positions that had never appeared in London's reports. As the true exposure was calculated over the following days, the loss was fixed at approximately 827 million. Against reported shareholders' funds of roughly 350 million, the loss was more than double the bank's capital. The institution was insolvent. On 26 February 1995, the Bank of England was informed. Efforts to find a buyer or arrange a rescue over that weekend failed because the total liability could not be capped. The options position carried further open-ended exposure to future market moves. On 27th of February, the fax reading "I'm sorry" was found in London. Barings was placed into administration. On 5th of March 1995, the Dutch bank ING acquired Barings for £1, assuming its liabilities. The individual at the centre of the Singapore operation was arrested in Frankfurt, extradited to Singapore, and in December 1995 pleaded guilty to charges including deceiving the firm's auditors and cheating Cymex. The Singapore court sentenced him to 6.5 years. The Board of Banking Supervision of the Bank of England published a report establishing the sequence: unauthorised directional positions concealed in account 8888, funded by margin transfers from London, undetected because trading and settlement authority were held by the same person. What the Barings case establishes is structural, and it concerns the relationship between margin and concealment. A futures exchange settles losses in cash every single day. This means a concealed futures loss cannot be a quiet accounting entry that sits undisturbed. It generates a daily cash demand that must be met from somewhere. In Barings, that somewhere was the parent bank, which funded the concealment without recognizing what it was funding. The margin call is a truth-telling mechanism. It converts an unrealized loss into an immediate cash obligation. The fraud did not defeat that mechanism. It redirected the cash obligation onto an institution that did not know it was paying. The case also establishes the specific failure mode of combined front office and back office authority. When the party creating positions also controls the records that verify them, the firm holds no independent number. Every internal check becomes circular. The direct regulatory consequence was a reordering of controls around trading operations, mandatory separation of dealing and settlement functions, independent reconciliation of positions against exchange records, and consolidated firm-wide monitoring of margin funding. The finding is not that a trader was permitted too much latitude. The finding is that a bank funded losses it could not see, because the one number that would have revealed them was produced by the same hand that created them.